The history of Indian reservations. How they came to be. Today, we're diving into one of the most complex and often misunderstood aspects of American history: the creation of Indian reservations. How did they come to be? What historical events led to their establishment? And how have they evolved over time? To answer these questions, we need to go back, way back, to the early days of European colonization and the policies that shaped the fate of indigenous peoples in North America. But before we get started, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And if you enjoy content like this, drop a comment below to let us know what topics you'd like to see next. Now let's get into it. Before European settlers arrived, the land we now call the United States was home to millions of indigenous people. Tribes such as the Cherokee, Sioux, Apache, and Iroquois thrived across vast and diverse landscapes. They had their own governments, economies, and cultures, which varied greatly depending on geography and resources. But with the arrival of European settlers, everything changed. At first, relationships between Native Americans and settlers varied, some engaged in trade, while others experienced conflict. However, as European colonies expanded, indigenous people were increasingly seen as obstacles to progress rather than sovereign nations. The first major policy that set the stage for Indian reservations was the signing of treaties between the U.S. government and Native American tribes. Many of these treaties promised land, resources, and protection in exchange for peace or land cessions. However, as history has shown, these promises were often broken. One of the earliest and most devastating policies was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. This act authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River, what would later become Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma. This led to the infamous Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee, Creek, and other tribes were forcibly marched to their new designated lands, suffering starvation, exposure, and disease. By the time they arrived, many had perished. As the United States expanded westward, conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes escalated. The U.S. government attempted to address this issue through a policy known as Indian Reservations. The concept was straightforward. Native Americans would be confined to designated areas of land, where they would live under government oversight. The government assured that these lands would belong to the tribes indefinitely, and they would receive supplies, food, and education. However, the reality was starkly different. The lands designated for reservations were often remote and lacked resources for farming or hunting. Many reservations were established on land deemed undesirable by settlers: arid deserts, rocky terrain, or isolated regions with little access to water, fertile soil, or game. For instance, the Navajo Reservation, the largest in the U.S., spans parts of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico, much of it consisting of dry, rugged desert where traditional agriculture is challenging. Similarly, the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, home to the Oglala Lakota, was placed in an area with extreme weather conditions, bitterly cold winters and hot, dry summers, making farming unreliable. Another example is the Fort Apache Reservation in Arizona, home to the White Mountain Apache tribe. While the land is mountainous and scenic, much of it is unsuitable for large-scale farming, forcing the tribe to rely on timber and tourism industries instead of traditional agriculture. In Oklahoma, where many southeastern tribes like the Cherokee and Creek were forcibly relocated after the Trail of Tears, the land was vastly different from their original homeland. While some areas were fertile, many tribal lands were eventually taken back by the government or sold to settlers, reducing their ability to sustain themselves. Additionally, hunting, once a crucial part of survival for many Plains tribes, became nearly impossible as reservations were placed far from traditional hunting grounds. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and other Great Plains tribes who once relied on vast buffalo herds were confined to smaller areas where buffalo had been nearly wiped out by overhunting. Without access to traditional food sources, many tribes became dependent on government rations, which were often inadequate and of poor quality. This created widespread malnutrition and hardship, deepening the struggles that Native communities faced under the reservation system. The promised aid rarely arrived as expected, and the government frequently reduced the size of reservations whenever settlers desired more land. The U.S. government had pledged food, supplies, medical care, and education to tribes in exchange for their forced relocation, but these promises were often neglected, delayed, or deliberately ignored. Many Native American communities on reservations were left to survive on substandard rations, which were sometimes spoiled, moldy, or entirely insufficient to meet their needs. For instance, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the government failed to provide adequate food, leading to malnutrition and starvation among the Lakota people. At times, the U.S. Army distributed food laced with contaminants, causing illness and death among already struggling tribes. Additionally, essential resources such as livestock, farming tools, and seeds, necessary for tribes to become self-sufficient, were either withheld or distributed in poor quality. On the Navajo Reservation, for example, the government provided sheep and cattle to encourage farming, but later, during the 1930s, the government ordered mass livestock reductions, devastating the Navajo economy. Not all Native Americans accepted these forced relocations. Throughout the mid to late 1800s, many tribes resisted the reservation system through armed conflicts, now known as the Indian Wars. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse of the Lakota fought to protect their lands, resulting in famous battles like the Battle of Little Bighorn, where General Custer and his men were defeated. But despite moments of victory, the overwhelming force of the U.S. military and continued settlement pressure led to the eventual confinement of most tribes to reservations. One of the final tragic events of this era was the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where U.S. soldiers killed over 250 Lakota men, women, and children. This effectively ended large-scale Native resistance. As the 19th century came to a close, the U.S. government shifted its approach. Instead of just confining Native Americans to reservations, they attempted to assimilate them into American society. The Dawes Act of 1887 divided reservation land into individual plots, giving Native families small parcels, while selling surplus land to white settlers. This resulted in tribes losing millions of acres of land. At the same time, Native children were forcibly taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions. The goal was to erase Native identity and culture, a policy that caused lasting trauma. The 20th century brought some reforms. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 attempted to restore tribal self-governance, but many issues persisted. During the 1950s, the U.S. government pursued policies of termination, aiming to dissolve reservations altogether and force assimilation once again. But Native communities fought back. In the 1960s and 70s, groups like the American Indian Movement or AIM protested unfair policies, leading to events like the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. Over time, activism led to greater recognition of Native sovereignty and the return of some lands to tribes. Today there are over 300 reservations in the U.S., home to about 1 million Native Americans. While reservations remain an important part of tribal identity, they still face challenges: poverty, underfunded healthcare, and legal disputes over land and resources. However, many tribes are rebuilding their communities, revitalizing languages, and asserting their rights in the courts and in Congress. The story of Indian reservations is still unfolding. The creation of Indian reservations is a story of resilience, struggle, and survival. It's a history that must be remembered, not just as a lesson from the past, but as a foundation for understanding the present and shaping the future. If you found this video insightful, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And let us know in the comments what topics you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.